It's great to be here, and I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing at the Chicago Botanic Garden. But first, start off telling you a little bit about my home away from home. I would not be doing my institution's service if I didn't invite you to come visit us and tell you about the wonderful institution, the Chicago Botanic Garden, where I do my work. I am the curator of woody plants at the Botanic Garden, where I'm responsible for developing the garden's tree and shrub collection. We are a display garden first and foremost, and that presents obviously a lot of positives, I think, because what we're doing is trying to sell pretty, and it's easy to sell pretty. Most people get that. But that's how our plants are displayed in a display context. But when you're responsible for developing that collection and wanting to maintain that collection from a research standpoint, it creates a lot of challenges. And I deal with those challenges every day because, again, first and foremost, we're all about pretty. And I felt like I've been at the garden now 7 years, and I feel like I'm finally getting to a point where some of the policies and thoughts that I brought to the table are being implemented. But one thing that I didn't feel like I personally had a handle on, or the institution, was the current state of our living collection, specifically for me, the woody plant collection. What is the current health of the collection? And so to do that, or to understand that more thoroughly, I knew that I didn't have the time to go systematically through the collection and evaluate each individual tree. But I did know that there were many funding opportunities out there that would assist me in doing that. And so I wrote a grant that was fortunately funded that helped or allowed me to hire a research assistant for 2 years who systematically went through our tree collection, assessed the health of every individual tree, and then allowed us to develop a very thoughtful plan how we're going to preserve this collection and how we're going to continue to develop it into the future. But there was also another component of that project that I'll come back to in just a minute. My additional responsibilities include serving as an advocate for trees in the Chicago region. And those are the trees that make up our urban forest that we've been talking about here this morning. Whether they be trees for the residential landscape, trees in our parks, schoolyards, cemeteries, all those components make up the urban forest. And then certainly the most challenging of all sites for trees, which is the urban center. As my responsibilities, as I mentioned, include being an advocate for urban forests. I was very fortunate to be asked to work with the city of Chicago on developing the urban forest agenda. There's a few other individuals in this room who also worked on this effort. It was a very long process and challenging at times, but we were able to come up with something I think was pretty thoughtful in the end. I served on the research and strategy working subcommittee, if you will. We were able to look at a lot of data, much of it from Dave, identifying areas of the city where that were most or highest priority for tree plantings, and those specifically where the urban heat island was most prevalent. We also looked at potential planting locations. Where are areas of the city where we could target that we could plant trees pretty easily? And those are represented here in this lighter green, where you have the bright green, those are existing tree plantings, but the lighter green represents potential planting locations. And if you were to look right here, you say, well, you have a big area right there that you could plant a bunch of trees, but you have to do some ground truthing, and this is that same site. And so we know we'll never be able to plant trees here, and certainly other areas of the city that would show up as potential planting locations would not be actual planting locations. The other thing that we kept talking about was what trees should we be planting? And this was a question that kept coming back to us, and we're doing all this work, developing an urban forest agenda. The justification behind that was climate change. And so we're accepting that climate change is happening. We're trying to address those issues. But the one issue we weren't addressing is what trees are being planted today that will continue to thrive and even survive in a changing climate. And this one particular tree was the one that really got to me. There was an article that was written that mentioned that in the future, white oak would no longer be able to grow in the Chicago area due to climate change. And it made me scratch my head. If our climate in the future is going to be more like eastern Oklahoma, Arkansas, white oak grows there. And so if it grows there now, and that's what our climate's going to be like in 20, 30, or 50 years, it seems like white oak would still be able to grow in the Chicago region. So I felt like what we really needed was a very thoughtful adaptive plant list. And that is one that would look at the climate in the future and look at the current trees that we're planting. And so this is the other aspect of the proposal, the grant proposal and project that I mentioned. We wanted to look at our own collection, but also do something that would benefit beyond the gates of the Chicago Botanic Garden. And I knew my colleagues at the Chicago Botanic Garden were using species distribution models, computer models, which is also called climate envelope models, to determine where plants in their native habitats, where they would be moving to, or where certain areas that they would be adapted to in the future based on climate change. And so I asked my colleagues who were doing this work, could you do that in a cultivated setting? They've been looking at trees in a natural setting, and my colleague Kay Haven said, well, you have to have data points for where those trees are current, or whatever you're looking at, that species is currently growing. And so that's very different from a cultivated setting. We can get data points for where plants grow in nature. We had that. There's a lot of that information available. But we needed data points for where trees are actually being cultivated. And so what we needed was a cultivated climate envelope for each of the species that we were interested in. There's 150 species that is on the City of Chicago's urban tree list. It takes a lot of time to model each plant. And so we were able to pare it down to what I thought was a good representation of that list to 50 species. We had to get data points, cultivated data points for each of those trees. The best way for us to do this was to survey our sister institutions in the public garden world, because we needed an actual location where that tree grows, and not only grows, but grows successfully. So these are the data points that were included with this study. Now, this is just the first part of this project. As I mentioned, this takes a lot of time, and this is, I don't want to run through each one of these bullet points, but this is some of the materials and methods for the research. I should have said at the beginning, but I'll say now, I'm not a climate change expert, I'm not a modeling expert, but I know people who are, and I make friends with them. And so this is, for those of you who are into climate modeling, this is what we used for this study. And then the parameters that we used were annual mean temperature, maximum mean temperature in the warmest month, temperature annual range, mean temperature of the warmest quarter, annual precipitation, and precipitation at the driest quarter. We also used other ones, but they didn't really strengthen the results of the model, so they were eliminated. This is a graph representing all 50 species that we looked at. I don't expect you to be able to identify each one individually, but just to point out a few things is that almost every species or taxa that we looked at increased in climatic suitability for the Chicago region in the year or the decade 2020. And at first, that caused a little concern about, are these models any good? These species should not be increasing in suitability. But it did make sense, because if you think about the trees that we grow here in the Chicago region, we're pretty much at the northern limit of most of their range from a cultivated setting. So if Chicago warms a few degrees, they're going to be more climatically suitable for this area. But then the depressing part of this set in when you look at 2050, the middle of the century, where every species that we looked at decreased, and then all the way down to, or all the way up to 2080, very depressing. If we look at a few examples here, one of the best performers in the entire study was Ginkgo biloba on the cultivar Autumn Gold. So if we, just to show you, point this out, this is current climatic suitability, 2020, 2050, and 2080. Green or yellow, it shows up green here and it looks more yellow on your screen, but green is more climatically suitable, and then it goes yellow to red, to being not climatically suitable. So Ginkgo was one of the best performers in the study, which I think is just amazing. This tree that's thought to be extinct, or is extinct in the wild. Maybe there's a few plants out there that are still naturally occurring. But it's been around for millions, hundreds of millions of years, and looks like it's going to be one of our best trees into the future. The one that did not perform well in the study was one of my favorite trees, Tilia americana, and you can see by 2080 that bright red throughout the Chicago region is no longer, based on the climate models that we used, climatically suitable. I didn't mention, but I should, it was in one of the slides there. We used the high emission scenario for this study, and some people would argue that we're being alarmist, that we're using the worst case scenario, but if you look at the data that we have at hand, we're already exceeding the worst case scenario, so it made sense for us to use that. I showed you two examples, one being one of the best performers in the study and then one that was the worst performer. And so I want to show you a few more here, highlight a few more. This is the top 15, if you will. I don't need to go down them mention each one specifically, but these are the ones that perform the best. And I think you can see that most of them represent what we already consider to be some of our best urban trees for this area. The bottom 10, however, are the ones that did not perform well in the study. Again, I've already mentioned Tilia americana. By 2050, so what we're looking at is percent change in climate suitability for this region. So if we go back to Tilia americana, by 2050, it will have lost 42% of its climatic suitability for this area. This study has gotten a lot of attention, and there's been a few critics out there, and I'm going to point out what they've criticized, and that is that shagbark hickory and then Australia virginiana. It's puzzling that they show up at the bottom of the list, the ones that were some of the worst performers. But I was pleased to hear that Dave just mentioned that shagbark hickory has not performed well in some of the other models, and so maybe I don't need to fret so much over that. But we are a little bit puzzled as to why those two did not perform well, primarily because if we look at where Australia virginiana occurs in nature, it occurs very far south, and you would think that it would be more tolerant to the potential effects that we will see from climate change. So we are in the process of rerunning these models using different protocols, and so we'll see if the results are any different when you use different methodology. There's a lot more information about this study. I pared this down quite a bit because I feel like maybe half the people in this room have heard me give this presentation already, so I didn't want to bore them. But I do want to let you know, if you're interested in what we did and how we did it, all that information is available to you on our website at the Botanic Garden. It provides the entire list of 50 trees. And I've heard it said several times, this new list that the Chicago Botanic Garden has put out. That wasn't the purpose of this study. It's not a new list that we're putting out, and it's not a comprehensive list. What it is a thorough review of the city of Chicago's current urban tree list and looking at those and seeing which ones the models predict will continue to perform well into the future. And so we were just hoping to add a little bit more information to that list. Now, most of you probably already know that the Morton Arboretum has taken on that effort with the elimination of the Department of Environment within the city of Chicago. So there is a revised tree list that's going to be coming out and incorporating some of these results. So if you do have any more questions or if you have questions about this, I'll be happy to answer them. I do need to thank my partners in all this. Again, I'm not a modeling expert, but Shannon Steele, who's at the Botanic Garden, is. He will be here tomorrow with a smaller group, but he's the one that worked with us a lot on this project. Emily Russell, who was my assistant curator for 2 years, who was her position was funded for this project by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and then a graduate student in her program with Northwestern, Paul Hartzog, worked on this as well.